They say silence is golden, but sometimes silence isn't empty. It's full of unsaid pain, unspoken plans, and a patience that is sharpening its claws. For some, silence is a retreat, a surrender. But for Amelia Thorne, silence became her sanctuary, her forge, and ultimately, her weapon. From her office on the 50th floor, the city of New York sprawled beneath her, a glittering map of conquered territory. The setting sun bled across the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows that stretched from one side of the Hudson to the other. Her office, walled in glass and minimalist steel, was a testament to a life built on precision, logic, and an unrelenting drive. It was a world away from the clatter of cheap ceramic plates and the smell of burnt coffee. On the expansive surface of her mahogany desk, among digital reports and architectural models, lay a single document printed on expensive resume paper. It was a ghost, an artifact from a buried life. The name at the top read Mark Ashton. The soft chime of her intercom sliced through the quiet hum of the climate control. Her assistant's voice was crisp, professional. "Miss Thorne, your final interview for the Chief Strategy Officer position is here. Mr. Ashton has arrived." Amelia took a long, slow breath, her posture unchanging, her gaze fixed on the skyline. There was no hatred churning in her stomach, no thrill of victory, no tremor of fear. There was only the cold, quiet hum of a machine reaching the end of its cycle, the profound stillness that comes when a plan, 15 years in the making, is about to reach its flawless conclusion. For a fleeting moment, the city lights blurred, momentarily replaced by the distorted view through a rain-streaked window pane of a tiny apartment in a forgotten borough. The memory came unbidden, carrying the phantom scent of damp coats and the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet. She could almost feel the worn fabric of her apron, her feet aching from a 12-hour shift. And then came the sound, not a shout, but a whisper, a confidential, dismissive tone that had been the catalyst for everything that followed. A voice, smooth and condescending, drifting from the other room, convinced of its own superiority. "Let's be realistic, Amelia. You'll never be more than a waitress." The memory vanished as quickly as it came. Amelia's gaze cleared, focusing once more on the name printed on the paper. A ghost, indeed, and it was time to face him. Her fingers, perfectly steady, moved from her desk to the intercom panel. She pressed the button, her voice perfectly level, betraying nothing of the storm that had just passed through her mind. Sent him in. 15 years earlier, Amelia's world was not made of glass and steel, but of formica countertops and the perpetual scent of frying bacon. Her life moved to the rhythm of clanking dishes and the gruff, hurried orders of strangers. She was 24, and the prestigious university acceptance letter that had once been her pride was now tucked away in a box, a relic of a dream deferred. Every morning, before the sun had a chance to warm the city streets, she would tie the strings of her faded apron, her body already aching in anticipation of the long hours ahead. She wasn't just a waitress, she was the architect of another person's dream. That person was Mark Ashton, her husband. Mark was beautiful, with a smile that could disarm criticism and a voice that painted futures in vivid, intoxicating color. He was a student at a top-tier business school, and his ambition was a fire that Amelia willingly fed with her own life force. Her tips, crumpled dollar bills and spare change, were carefully counted and deposited, becoming tuition payments and textbook fees. Her exhaustion was the fuel for his late-night study sessions. She believed in him with the fierce, unyielding faith of a true believer. When he spoke of the future, it was always our future. He would talk of the corner office he would command, the penthouse apartment overlooking the park, the European vacations they would take. He made it all sound like a shared victory, the inevitable result of their combined effort. Amelia would listen, her heart swelling with pride, as she massaged her tired feet after a double shift. She saw her sacrifice not as a loss, but as an investment in their shared destiny. She was the foundation upon which he was building their empire, and she was content with her role, never realizing that foundations are meant to be unseen, buried deep in the dirt. The first crack in this idyllic facade was his mother, Eleanor Ashton, a woman sculpted from old money and icy disdain, Eleanor viewed Amelia's presence in her son's life as a temporary and rather distasteful necessity. Sunday dinners at the Ashton estate were a masterclass in passive aggression. The house was cavernous and silent, filled with polished silver and ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow Amelia with quiet judgment. Eleanor would look at Amelia's hands, calloused from work, and make a veiled comment about the importance of a good manicure. She would ask, with a saccharine smile, "Are you still enjoying that little diner job, dear? It must be so quaint, meeting all those colorful people." To Eleanor, Amelia was not a daughter-in-law, she was a means to an end. A serviceable, working-class girl who could fund Mark's ascent, after which she could be easily discarded, like scaffolding from a completed building. Mark, for his part, would handle his mother with a placating charm. "Mother, Amelia is working incredibly hard for us," he would say, the word us, a comforting balm on Amelia's anxieties. But he never truly defended her. He never drew a line in the sand. He treated his mother's cruelty as a personality quirk, an eccentricity to be managed rather than confronted, leaving Amelia to absorb the poison of Eleanor's condescension alone. And then there was Clara, Amelia's younger sister. Clara was her confidant, her port in the storm. When the weight of Eleanor's snobbery and Mark's demanding schedule became too much, Amelia would call Clara, and Clara would always be there, her voice a soothing symphony of support. "Oh, Amy, you're a saint," she would coo. "Don't you listen to that old witch. She's just jealous because you have Mark, and you're both going to be so successful." Clara would listen patiently as Amelia confessed her fears and her fatigue, and then she would expertly weave a narrative of reassurance. "He loves you more than anything," she'd insist. "He's just under so much pressure to succeed, for both of you." Amelia would hang up the phone feeling validated, her resolve strengthened, her doubts silenced. She never noticed the faint, almost imperceptible edge of envy in her sister's voice. She never questioned why Clara always steered the conversation back to Mark's brilliance, to the glorious future that awaited them, subtly reinforcing the idea that Amelia's suffering was not just necessary, but noble. Amelia existed in the center of this carefully constructed illusion, a world where her husband was a future king, her mother-in-law a harmless dragon to be ignored, and her sister a loyal handmaiden. She was the tireless engine at the heart of their lives, celebrated with empty words and placating smiles. She mistook Mark's ambition for a shared dream, Eleanor's contempt for generational friction, and Clara's poison for sisterly love. She was a willing participant in her own deception, because to admit the truth that she was being used, that her love was not cherished, but consumed, was a reality far more painful than any double shift could ever be. So she continued to pour the coffee, to count the tips, and to dream of a future that had already been written without her. The breaking point did not arrive like a thunderclap. It came in a whisper, on a Tuesday night in late October, carried on the back of a storm that had been threatening the city for days. Rain lashed against the thin glass of their apartment window, and the wind howled a mournful song through the eaves. Mark was late, supposedly held up at a final review session for his midterms. Amelia had finished her shift hours ago, the familiar ache in her bones, a dull, rhythmic companion. She had prepared a plate of food for him, leaving it covered on the counter, a small, hopeful gesture against the growing unease she felt. She tried to read, but the words swam on the page, her focus lost to the symphony of the storm and the ticking of the clock. Eventually, she retreated to their small bedroom, lying in the dark, listening. When he finally came home, well after midnight, he moved with a practiced stealth, believing her to be asleep. He shed his wet coat at the door, the scent of rain and the city clinging to him. Amelia remained perfectly still, her breathing even, feigning a sleep she was far from. He didn't come to the bedroom right away. Instead, she heard the soft click of the sliding glass door to their tiny enclosed balcony. It was his preferred spot for private calls, a small pocket of air suspended 3 stories above the glistening, empty street. Through the drumming of the rain, she heard the low murmur of his voice. It was different from his usual tired, end-of-day tone. This was a voice she rarely heard, one reserved for moments of unguarded confidence. It was smooth, relaxed, and laced with an easy, almost cruel amusement. Curiosity, a cold and sudden thing, pricked at her. She strained to listen, her body rigid in the darkness. At first she couldn't make out the words, only the cadence. Then she heard a laugh, a low, intimate chuckle that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't meant for her. And then she heard the faint, tinny response from the phone, another laugh, a high-pitched, feminine sound, a sound she knew as well as her own heartbeat. It was Clara, her sister. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Why would Clara be talking to Mark in the middle of the night, in secret? Her mind scrambled for an innocent explanation, a reason, any reason at all. But her heart, a sudden traitor, knew. She lay there, a prisoner in her own bed, as the whispers from the balcony began to coalesce into words, each one a shard of ice piercing the warm bubble of her life. "It's almost over," Mark was saying, his voice a conspiratorial murmur. "Another 6 months, tops. Once I graduate, Mother has the position at Sterling Corp lined up. The real money starts then." There was a pause. "No, she has no idea," he said, and Amelia knew, with a certainty that hollowed out her soul, that he was talking about her. "She's so caught up in the struggle, she doesn't see the finish line. She thinks it's our finish line." He laughed again, a sound of pure mockery. "It's almost sad." Amelia felt the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. She was paralyzed, forced to listen to the casual, systematic dismantling of her entire existence. She heard him reassure Clara, promising her that the transition would be seamless. He would secure the job, establish himself, and then he would end his marriage. He spoke of it with the detached pragmatism of a business merger, a simple matter of assets and liabilities. And Amelia, it was clear, was the liability to be shed. Then came the moment that would forever divide her life into a before and an after. She could hear the faint buzz of Clara's voice asking a question, a playful, prodding tone. And Mark's reply, dripping with a condescension so profound it was almost breathtaking. "Feel bad? Clara, let's be realistic," he said, his voice softening into a tone of mock patience, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "She's sweet, but what more can she offer?" This was a means to an end. We both knew that. And then, the final, fatal blow. "She'll never be more than a waitress." The words hung in the stormy air, a death sentence for a life she thought was hers. They were not spoken in anger, but as a simple, unchangeable fact, like the sky being blue or the rain being wet. In that single, devastating sentence, he stripped her of all value, all potential, and reduced her entire identity to the faded apron she wore every day. The silence that followed was broken by the most terrible sound Amelia had ever heard. From the phone, she heard Clara giggle. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a soft, triumphant, complicit little sound. It was the sound of a shared secret, a victory won. It was the sound of her own sister, her confidant, dancing on the grave of her heart. In that moment, something inside Amelia didn't just break, it vaporized. It turned into a cold, quiet, empty space. There were no tears, no screams, just a profound, echoing silence in her soul as the foundations of her world crumbled to dust. Every sacrifice she had made, every exhausting hour, every dollar she had earned, was not an investment in a shared future, but a payment for her own planned obsolescence. The storm outside raged on, but inside Amelia, it had already passed, leaving behind a devastation so complete, so absolute, that it was almost calm. Mark eventually ended his call and slipped into the room. He glanced at her still form in the bed, and in the faint light from the window, she saw the shadow of a smile on his face. He thought she was sleeping. He thought he was safe. He slid into bed beside her, the lingering cold of the rain on his skin, oblivious to the fact that he was lying next to a woman who had just died, and the ghost that was left in her place was already beginning to plan. Amelia did not sleep. She lay in the silent darkness, a statue of flesh and bone, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. Beside her, Mark slept the peaceful, dreamless sleep of the truly selfish, his steady breathing a slow, rhythmic torture. The storm inside her had passed, leaving behind a strange and terrible clarity. The grief was there, a vast, cold ocean beneath the surface, but it was frozen over. The tears she expected to shed remained unshed, locked away behind a wall of ice. In their place, something new and hard began to form in the hollowed-out space in her chest. It was not anger, which is a hot and blinding thing. It was resolve, cold and sharp, and perfectly clear. She did not mourn the death of her marriage. She began, with methodical precision, to plan her escape from its tomb. She saw the night through, watching as the black of the window pane softened to gray, then to the pale, watery light of dawn. The morning routine was a grotesque pantomime of normalcy. Mark awoke, cheerful and refreshed, complaining about the storm and boasting about how well his study session had gone. He kissed her cheek, a casual, meaningless gesture that made her skin crawl. He talked about his day, about a difficult professor, about the future that was now so close he could taste it. Amelia listened, her face a placid mask, offering quiet, non-committal responses that he mistook for her usual morning fatigue. She watched him, really watched him, for the first time without the distorting filter of love. She saw a man who was not a future king, but a hollow shell, propped up by the work and adoration of others. A parasite, dressed in charm. He saw a tired waitress, his dutiful, simple wife. He had no idea he was looking at his executioner. The moment the apartment door clicked shut behind him, Amelia began to move. There was no hesitation, no frantic rush. Every action was deliberate, efficient, and final. She pulled a worn duffel bag from the back of the closet, the one she'd used for a high school trip years ago. She walked through the small apartment, a ghost in her own life, and saw everything for what it was, a collection of props for a play in which she had been the fool. The sofa they had picked out together, the photographs on the wall, the books he had bought with her money, they held no sentimental value now. They were artifacts of a grand deception. She packed only the things that were truly hers. 3 changes of practical clothing, a worn copy of a novel from her childhood, the university acceptance letter, a reminder of the person she had been before she had sacrificed herself, and a small, framed photograph of her parents, the only 2 people whose love had ever been unconditional. She walked to the bank, the same one where she deposited her crumpled tips every week. She stood in line, calm and anonymous, and when her turn came, she closed her account, withdrawing every last cent. The total was pitifully small, barely enough for a bus ticket and a few weeks of rent in the cheapest of rooms. But to Amelia, it was everything. It was the seed from which a new world would grow. It was the price of her freedom. Her final act was the most symbolic. Back in the apartment, she surveyed the silent rooms one last time. Then, she slid the simple gold wedding band from her finger. For years, it had felt like a part of her. Now, it felt like a shackle. She placed it squarely in the center of the kitchen table, where the morning light caught it, making it gleam. There was no note, no angry letter, no tear-stained explanation. A letter would have been an appeal, a cry for recognition. It would have validated their power over her. The ring, alone and silent, was a statement. It was a full stop. It was an erasure. A life, a marriage, a promise, all reduced to a single silent object. The absence of words was her final word to him. You are not worth an explanation. You are not worth the energy of my rage. You are, from this moment on, nothing. As she walked away from the building, she did not look back. She could already imagine the scene that would play out that evening. Mark would come home, see the ring, and feel not sorrow, but irritation. A wave of annoyance at the inconvenience. He would call Eleanor, his voice a mix of frustration and feigned victimhood. And Eleanor, oh, Eleanor would be triumphant. I told you, darling, she would say, her voice dripping with vindication. Blood will out. You can't make a silk purse from a sow's ear. She was never good enough for you. They would decide, together, that Amelia had run off, that she was unstable, ungrateful, a childish runaway unable to handle the pressures of his important life. Her disappearance would not be a mystery to be solved, but a problem that had conveniently solved itself. Their underestimation of her was so complete, so absolute, it was its own form of blindness. They cast her out of their minds, discarding her like a piece of trash, never once imagining that trash, buried under enough pressure, can sometimes turn into a diamond. Or, in this case, into sharpened steel. Amelia sat on a bus, heading west, the city she had sacrificed so much for shrinking in the distance. The pain was a physical presence, a cold, heavy stone in her gut, but it was no longer just pain. It was fuel. And for the first time in a very long time, she was not looking back at a life that was ending, but forward, into the vast, unknown territory of her own becoming. The bus ticket bought a one-way trip to anonymity. Amelia stepped onto the pavement of a sprawling, indifferent Midwestern city where her name meant nothing and her past was a ghost no one could see. For the first time, she was utterly, terrifyingly alone, and in that solitude, she found a strange, stark freedom. She shed the name Amelia Thorne like a heavy coat, becoming simply Amy, a woman with no history. Her first home was a shoebox apartment on the 4th floor of a walk-up, with peeling paint, a window that overlooked a graffiti-scarred brick wall, and a radiator that hissed and clanked like a dying beast. To an outsider, it was a place of deep poverty and despair. To Amy, it was a fortress, a command center, a monastic cell where she could begin the arduous work of her own reinvention. Survival was a brutal, relentless calculus. Her meager savings evaporated within weeks, and she was thrust into a grueling existence that made her previous life as a waitress seem like a luxury. She did not take one job, she took 3. From 5 in the morning until noon, she was a dishwasher in the steamy, chaotic kitchen of an all-night diner, her hands perpetually raw and chapped. From 1 to 5, she cleaned rooms at a cheap motel, scrubbing away the filth left by strangers, her movements mechanical, her mind a universe away. And from 7 until midnight, she was part of a cleaning crew at a downtown office building, pushing a vacuum cleaner through silent, empty hallways that smelled of industrial disinfectant and the faint, lingering scent of other people's success. She barely slept. She ate cheap noodles and day-old bread. Her body was a machine she pushed to its absolute limit, and the physical exhaustion was a welcome anesthetic for the persistent ache in her soul. This was her crucible. Every plate she scrubbed clean was a moment of her own naivety she was washing away. Every floor she polished was a step away from the woman who had let others walk all over her. It was a self-imposed penance, a physical trial to purify herself of the past. But this brutal routine was only the foundation. Her true work, the work of her rebirth, began in the harsh, fluorescent glare of a community college classroom. She enrolled in the computer science program, a choice born of a desperate need for order in the emotional chaos of her life. The world of programming was a sanctuary of pure logic. It was a universe governed by immutable rules, where there were no hidden meanings, no passive aggression, no smiling betrayals. A line of code either worked or it didn't. An argument was either true or it was false. In this world, she was not a victim of circumstance. She was the creator. She was the architect. The control she found in crafting elegant, functional algorithms was the most intoxicating power she had ever felt. She attacked her studies with a ferocious, almost terrifying intensity. She was older than most of her classmates, a quiet woman who sat in the front row, her face etched with a seriousness they couldn't comprehend. While they were distracted by parties and relationships, Amy was in the library until closing, hunched over a terminal, the complex lines of syntax on the screen, a language that spoke directly to her wounded soul. She was not just learning to code, she was rewriting herself. Each bug she meticulously hunted down and fixed was a past weakness she was identifying and eradicating. Each complex problem she solved was a testament to a mind that was far more than what others had judged it to be. The pain of her past was not a memory she tried to suppress, it was the very engine of her ambition. When her eyes burned from staring at the screen and her mind screamed for sleep, she would summon the memory of Eleanor's dismissive, icy gaze, and it would push her through another chapter. When a concept seemed impossibly complex, she would hear the echo of Mark's voice in her head, that final, damning verdict: "She'll never be more than a waitress." The phrase was no longer an insult. It was a mantra. It was the crack of a whip that drove her onward, harder and faster. The memory of Clara's treacherous giggle became the rhythm to which she typed, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a cold and furious precision. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, things began to change. The tired woman who had arrived in the city with nothing but a bag and a broken heart began to disappear. In her place, someone new was being forged. The first sign was a notoriously difficult exam, one that half the class failed. Amy received a perfect score. Then, a professor, a brilliant but cantankerous man who respected nothing but raw talent, singled her out, handing her a complex problem that had stumped his graduate students. She solved it in a weekend. She began to feel a different kind of power stirring within her, a power that had nothing to do with beauty or charm or the approval of others. It was the power of pure competence, the power of a mind that could build worlds from nothing but logic and light. She was no longer running from her past. She was using it, transforming its toxic energy into a clean, white-hot fire that was burning away the person she had been, revealing the formidable woman she was always meant to become. The ashes of Amelia Thorne were becoming the foundation of a fortress named Amy. Competence is a language that needs no translation. In the silent, logical world of code, Amy's brilliance began to speak for itself, and soon people began to listen. The first person to truly hear it was her professor, a cantankerous genius named Alistair Finch, who saw in her not just a student, but a peer. He made a call to a former student of his, David Chen, the founder and CEO of a small, scrappy tech startup called Kinetic Solutions. His recommendation was simple and direct: "I'm sending you an intern. She doesn't talk much, but her code is poetry. Don't be a fool and waste her talent on coffee runs." Amy walked into the chaotic, open-plan office of Kinetic Solutions and found a new kind of crucible. It was a world of brilliant, fast-talking young engineers, and at first she was an enigma. She was quiet, intense, and older than the other interns. She ate lunch alone at her desk, her gaze fixed on her monitor. She never joined the casual conversations or the after-work drinks. They saw her as an outsider, an oddity. But then, they saw her work. There was a legacy data migration tool at the company that was notoriously buggy. It was a mess of patched-together code written by engineers who had long since left, and it would crash unpredictably, costing the company hours of work. The senior staff had deemed it a lost cause, something to be worked around rather than fixed. Amy, tasked with a minor, unrelated debugging project, took it upon herself to study the broken tool in her own time. For a week, she traced its fractured logic, sleeping in 2-hour increments and subsisting on vending machine coffee. One Monday morning, she quietly submitted a report to David Chen. It not only identified the core architectural flaw but included a complete, elegantly rewritten module that not only fixed the bug but made the tool run 3 times faster. An audible silence fell over the engineering department when the report was circulated. David Chen called her into his office. He looked at her, a quiet woman in a simple, worn-out sweater, and saw for the first time the formidable intellect hiding behind her guarded exterior. That was the beginning. David became her mentor. A self-made man who had also fought his way up from nothing, he recognized the same relentless fire in her eyes. He began to pull her into high-level meetings, asking for her input on strategic problems. He saw that she possessed a rare combination of deep technical understanding and a natural, intuitive grasp of systems and efficiency. He taught her the language of business, of venture capital, market disruption, and scalable growth. He was the first person in a long time who demanded nothing from her but the best of her mind, and under his guidance, Amy began to truly thrive. She learned to speak in boardrooms, her voice quiet, but her arguments so well-reasoned and data-driven that they were impossible to ignore. She was no longer just a coder, she was becoming a strategist. It was during a project on data security that the idea sparked. She saw a fundamental vulnerability in the way corporations manage their internal data streams, a gaping hole that everyone acknowledged but no one had addressed with an elegant, holistic solution. Her mind, now a finely tuned engine of logic and innovation, began to work on the problem. In the late hours of the night, in her small, quiet apartment, she began to build a new kind of system, a revolutionary software architecture that was more secure, more efficient, and more intelligent than anything currently on the market. She worked on the prototype for 6 months, a secret project fueled by a vision that was entirely her own. When it was ready, she showed it to David. He sat in silence for an hour, studying her work, a look of profound awe on his face. When he finally looked up, he said, "Amy, what you've built here, this isn't a feature for my company. This is its own company, and you have to be the one to run it." For a moment, fear flickered in her. It was one thing to be a brilliant engineer in someone else's company. It was another thing entirely to step into the spotlight, to be the founder, the leader. But then she thought of Mark, of Eleanor, of Clara. She thought of their certainty about her limits, of the small box they had built for her in their minds. That thought extinguished the fear and left only cold, hard resolve. David Chen became her first investor, his faith in her the final piece of validation she needed. She resigned from Kinetic Solutions, and with David's backing and her own revolutionary prototype, she founded Nexus Innovations. The name was deliberate. A nexus is a central point, a core of connection and control. That is what she was building for her clients, and what she had finally found for herself. The early days of Nexus were a blur of 18-hour workdays, of pitching to skeptical venture capitalists who saw a quiet woman, not a visionary CEO, and of winning them over with the undeniable brilliance of her product. This time, the sacrifice was not for someone else's dream. Every sleepless night, every ounce of effort, was an investment in herself. The work did not drain her, it empowered her. Nexus Innovations did not just survive, it soared. Her software was a game changer, and the company became a rising star in the tech world. One afternoon, she was approving the design for her new business cards. The proof read, "Amy, CEO." She stared at it for a long time. The name felt like a costume that no longer fit. Amy was the survivor, the dishwasher, the student hiding in the library, the woman who had built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing, the woman who commanded the respect of an entire industry, was someone else. She had earned the right to her own name again. She sent the proof back with a single correction. The next day, a new box arrived. The cards were thick, embossed, and minimalist. They read, "Amelia Thorne, Chief Executive Officer." Holding it in her hand, she felt the last fragment of the broken-hearted waitress fall away. Amelia Thorne was not a victim. She was not a memory. She was a name that would soon be synonymous with power. Years passed. The name Amelia Thorne became a quiet power in the world of technology. Nexus Innovations grew from a disruptive startup into a corporate titan, its elegant, impenetrable software systems becoming the gold standard for data security worldwide. Amelia, the CEO, was an enigma. In an industry dominated by bombastic personalities and casual hoodies, she was a figure of cool, disciplined reserve. She was known for her strategic brilliance, her uncanny ability to predict market shifts, and her icy calm under pressure. Her public persona was flawless, her private life a closed book. She lived in a minimalist penthouse apartment that was more a sanctuary of order and silence than a home. The fortress she had built around her heart was as secure as the code she wrote. The past was a country to which she never returned, a language she no longer spoke. The fire of her betrayal was not extinguished. It was now the controlled, silent, and immensely powerful core of a nuclear reactor powering her ascent. The past did not announce its return with a knock. It arrived as a whisper, a single line of text in a digital river of information. It happened on a Thursday morning. Amelia was reviewing a customized financial news brief prepared by her analytics team, her eyes scanning reports on market trends, competitor acquisitions, and global economic indicators. Tucked away near the bottom, under a minor heading for regional business failures, was a small, insignificant article. The headline read, "Ashton Advisory Group on the Brink of Collapse." The name Ashton was common enough, but it snagged a thread in the tightly woven tapestry of her memory. She read the first line, "The consulting firm, founded by CEO Mark Ashton, has reportedly failed to secure a second round of funding, facing imminent insolvency." The flow of time seemed to stutter. Mark Ashton. The name did not detonate like a bomb in her mind. Instead, it landed like a single, perfectly preserved fossil discovered in a layer of ancient rock. It was a relic from another geological era of her life. She felt no jolt of pain, no surge of anger, only a profound, cold stillness and a flicker of clinical curiosity. She finished her coffee. She led a 2-hour board meeting with her usual unflappable precision, dissecting quarterly earnings reports and outlining the company's expansion strategy for the next fiscal year. To any observer, it was a morning like any other. But once the meeting was adjourned and she was alone in the quiet of her office, she made a call. It was to a discreet corporate intelligence firm that Nexus used for vetting potential acquisitions and high-level hires. Her instructions were brief and devoid of emotion. "I need a comprehensive background dossier," she said, her voice level. "2 individuals, Mark Ashton and Clara Ashton, maiden name Vance. I want a full workup, career trajectory, complete financial statements, asset and liability analysis, personal connections. I want to know every dollar they owe and who they owe it to. The work is to be thorough, and it is to be completely invisible." She was not a woman searching for a lost love or a painful memory. She was a predator that had just caught the scent of long-forgotten prey. A week later, a thick, spiral-bound dossier arrived by courier. That evening, in the stark silence of her apartment, with the city lights glittering like a diamond field below, Amelia began to read. The report was a masterpiece of dispassionate, factual storytelling. The first page was a photograph from their wedding 10 years ago. Mark was handsome and smug in his tuxedo. Clara was radiant, her smile a little too sharp, a little too triumphant. They looked like the perfect couple, entitled and immaculate. There was another photo of them with a young boy, their son, on the lawn of a large suburban home. Amelia stared at the image, feeling nothing but a distant, analytical detachment. They had built their life, just as they had planned. But as she turned the pages, the glossy facade began to crack. Mark's career was a textbook example of mediocrity failing upwards. He had started strong at his mother's friend's firm, just as planned. But the report detailed a slow, steady decline, a series of lateral moves, a mutually agreed-upon resignation, a string of less prestigious jobs, each one a step down from the last. The narrative was clear. He was a man whose charm and connections could get him in the door, but whose arrogance and lack of substance ensured he would eventually be shown it. He had the vocabulary of success, but none of the talent. Then came the financials, and the picture sharpened into a portrait of spectacular desperation. They were living in a house of cards, a massive mortgage on a home they couldn't afford, leases on 2 German luxury cars, staggering country club dues, and an ocean of credit card debt spread across 16 different accounts. They were living a life dictated by Eleanor's expectations and their own vanity, a performance funded entirely by debt. They were one emergency away from total ruin. The Ashton Advisory Group was his last, desperate gamble, a vanity project funded by a second mortgage and what was left of his mother's dwindling estate. It was, the report concluded, a catastrophic failure. Amelia closed the dossier. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the city. There was no joy, no triumphant surge of, "I told you so." There was only the calm, satisfying clarity of a complex equation resolving itself. She finally understood. Their entire life was a lie. They hadn't won. They had simply been running a race on credit, and the bill was finally coming due. They had imprisoned themselves in a beautiful cage of their own making, and the bars were forged from their own greed and pride. In that moment, the vague, abstract concept of success being the best revenge felt childish and insufficient. A direct confrontation, an angry revelation that would be messy, unsatisfying. It would give them a victim stage to play on. True justice, she realized, required a more elegant design. It required their participation. She would not simply watch them fall. She would orchestrate the fall, and she would make them believe, until the very last moment, that they were flying. The whispers from the past had finally provided her with a blueprint. She now knew all their weaknesses, their desires, their desperation, and she was going to build them a trap so beautiful, they would tear each other apart to be the first to walk into it. Amelia Thorne did not believe in the chaotic, passionate nature of revenge. She believed in systems. Her entire life, her entire success, was built on understanding, designing, and controlling complex systems. And as she studied the dossier that laid out the fragile, debt-ridden architecture of Mark and Clara's life, she saw it as nothing more than a poorly designed system, full of vulnerabilities, ripe for a controlled demolition. Her plan, when it began to form, was not a wild fantasy of angry confrontation. It was a cold, elegant, and utterly silent strategy of financial strangulation. It would be a revenge executed not with a dagger, but with a balance sheet. The first step was to become a ghost, working with her most trusted legal and financial advisors, people bound to her by ironclad NDAs and immense loyalty. She began to construct an invisible empire. A series of shell corporations and holding companies were created, entities that existed only in the digital ether and the labyrinthine legal codes of offshore banking. They had bland, forgettable names: Blackwood Holdings, Orion Capital Ventures, the Sterling Group. They were phantoms with immense financial power, and their sole purpose was to serve as her proxies in the coming acquisition. Her team began the hunt. It was a quiet and patient process, an exercise in corporate predation. The first target was the business loan for the Ashton Advisory Group. The bank that held the loan considered it toxic debt, a high-risk asset on their books. When an obscure entity named Blackwood Holdings made an offer to buy the loan in full, the bank eagerly accepted, happy to offload the risk. In a single, sterile wire transfer, Mark's professional fate was placed directly into Amelia's hands. Next came the second mortgage on their sprawling suburban home. The original lender, a regional bank, sold it to a larger financial group, which then bundled it with other mortgages and sold it on the secondary market. Amelia's agents at Orion Capital Ventures tracked the transaction and purchased the specific debt instrument that contained the Ashton mortgage. They now owned the roof over their heads. Finally, the most undignified of their debts, the mountain of high-interest credit card balances. Bundles of this consumer debt were regularly sold off by credit card companies. Like a whale filtering krill from the ocean, Amelia's team sifted through these markets, acquiring every last dollar of debt linked to the names Mark and Clara Ashton. Within 6 months, a monumental shift in power had occurred, entirely in secret. Mark and Clara believed they were indebted to a dozen different banks and corporations. In reality, they now owed everything: their business, their home, their lifestyle, to a single, silent creditor. They were, for all intents and purposes, completely owned by the woman they had thrown away. With all the strings now held firmly in her grasp, Amelia began to pull. Her approach was not a sudden, violent yank, but a slow, methodical tightening, designed to create a sense of ever-increasing, inexplicable pressure. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, bearing the letterhead of Orion Capital Ventures. It was a standard, impersonal notice informing them that the servicing of their second mortgage had been transferred. A small, unsettling disruption. A month later, a far more chilling letter arrived at Mark's office from Blackwood Holdings. Citing clauses in the original loan agreement regarding the company's poor financial performance, it informed him that the interest rate on his business loan was being raised by 3 percentage points, effective immediately. Mark, Amelia learned from the intelligence updates she received, flew into a rage. He railed against the vulture capitalists and the predatory lenders, never once suspecting the attack was anything but the random cruelty of the market. He saw it as a terrible string of bad luck. The squeeze continued, relentless and systematic. Credit lines they had with other institutions were suddenly and inexplicably reduced, a consequence of their worsening credit score as Amelia's entities reported their financial status. They tried to refinance their home, the application was denied. They were trapped. Amelia would read the encrypted updates on her tablet each morning as she drank her tea. Subject A, Mark, had a heated argument with Subject B, Clara, regarding the liquidation of their stock portfolio. One report read, "Subject C, Eleanor, was contacted for a financial bailout and refused, citing her own recent losses," read another. Amelia observed their panic with the detached curiosity of a scientist watching a specimen under a microscope. Their carefully curated world was beginning to fracture under the strain, and they were turning on each other, just as she knew they would. The final move against the Ashton Advisory Group was the coup de grace. With the company bleeding money and in clear violation of its loan covenants, Amelia gave the order. A formal, legally airtight demand letter was dispatched from Blackwood Holdings, calling the entire business loan due for immediate repayment. They were given 30 days. It was an impossible, catastrophic demand. It was the kill shot, the carefully constructed facade of Mark Ashton, successful businessman, shattered. The company imploded, a supernova of debt. A short, brutal article in the financial press announced that the Ashton Advisory Group had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. All assets were to be liquidated. All employees, including the CEO, were terminated. A final email landed in Amelia's inbox, its subject line a single sterile word, complete. She read the confirmation, took a sip of her jasmine tea, and archived the message. The first phase of her plan was over. The net had been drawn tight. The prey was wounded, cornered, and officially destitute. Mark Ashton was no longer just a failure. He was a desperate man. And a desperate man will grasp at any lifeline, no matter how unbelievable it seems. It was time to prepare the bait. In the silent, cavernous rooms of the house he could no longer afford, Mark Ashton was a king ruling over an empire of dust and debt. The bankruptcy of his firm had been more than a financial blow. It was a profound emasculation. The swagger in his step was gone, replaced by the restless, agitated pacing of a caged animal. His days were a long, humiliating stretch of silence, broken only by the ringing of phones he no longer answered and the arrival of mail he was afraid to open. His conversations with Clara had devolved into a toxic cycle of blame and recrimination. She accused him of failure. He accused her of being a financial drain. The love and complicity that had once bound them together in their shared betrayal of Amelia had curdled into the bitter resentment of two co-conspirators trapped in the wreckage of their own failed coup. His mother, Eleanor, offered not comfort, but the cold, cutting pity of a disappointed investor. Mark was adrift in a sea of his own making, and he was drowning. It was in this fertile ground of desperation and wounded pride that Amelia planted the seed of her trap. In the pristine, silent boardroom of Nexus Innovations, she convened a small, trusted team. The mission was not to design a product, but to architect a temptation so perfect, so exquisitely tailored to their target, that it would be irresistible. "He will be arrogant, but also desperate," Amelia stated, her voice calm and analytical. "Arrogance makes a man blind, and desperation makes him reckless. We will exploit both." The position would not be at Nexus Innovations. That name, she knew, might trigger a flicker of caution, a distant memory. Instead, the trap would be set at a recently acquired subsidiary, a chic and highly respected data analytics firm called Aura Analytics. It had a reputation for being innovative and exclusive, a brand that would appeal directly to Mark's snobbery. The title was chosen with surgical precision, Chief Strategy Officer. It was a title that suggested vision, importance, and power, without the messy day-to-day responsibilities of running a company, a role for which Mark had already proven himself spectacularly inept. The job description itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, written not by human resources, but by Amelia herself. It was a love letter to Mark's ego. It called for a visionary leader with a proven track record in legacy financial markets, a direct appeal to his glory days at Sterling Corp. It requested experience in navigating complex stakeholder relationships, a flattering euphemism for his ability to manipulate his mother and her wealthy friends. Every line was filled with the kind of corporate jargon he loved, making him feel as if the role had been designed by a committee of his own admirers. And then there was the bait itself, the golden hook, the compensation package. The salary was a breathtaking figure, an amount so extravagant it would not only erase their mountain of debt, but would catapult them back into the stratosphere of the wealthy elite they so desperately wanted to be. It was, as Amelia explained to her team, a number designed to silence the rational mind. It is the sound of a dream so loud it deafens all doubt. The trap was set. The job was posted on exclusive, high-level executive recruitment platforms. Discreet calls were made to headhunters known for placing executives, subtly pointing them towards the opening and the profile of a seasoned, temporarily displaced executive like Mark Ashton. Weeks passed. Amelia waited with the unnerving patience of a spider in the center of her web. Meanwhile, Mark was living in his own private hell. Every day was a miserable scroll through job sites, a parade of humiliatingly junior roles and rejections. He was a king being offered jobs as a court jester. Then, one bleak afternoon, he saw it. The posting for Chief Strategy Officer at Aura Analytics. He read the description, and his heart began to hammer in his chest. It was as if the universe had finally recognized its mistake and was offering him a personal apology. The role wasn't just a good fit, it was him. He didn't question its perfection. His ego provided the simple answer. The job was perfect because he was the perfect candidate. He showed it to Clara, and for the first time in months, the fighting stopped. A single, shared flame of desperate hope was lit in the darkness of their ruin. Mark applied, and the gears of Amelia's machine began to turn. Her instructions to her hand-picked HR team were explicit. His application was to be fast-tracked. Every stage of the process was to be a carefully managed exercise in ego inflation. The initial phone screening was conducted by a recruiter who treated him with the reverence due to a visiting dignitary. "Your background is incredibly impressive, Mr. Ashton," she purred. The first video interview was with two junior executives who were well rehearsed. They asked him leading questions, allowing him to spin his spectacular failures into heroic tales of learning and resilience. They nodded earnestly, took copious notes, and showered him with praise for his unparalleled strategic insights. After each stage, he received an email overflowing with positive feedback. The team was universally impressed. "You are, without question, our top candidate." They were carefully rebuilding the pedestal from which he had fallen, and he climbed back onto it without a moment's hesitation, believing he was doing it all himself. He was so consumed by his own brilliant performance that he never bothered to look behind the curtain. He never did a deep dive into Aura Analytics' parent company. He never asked about the CEO he was scheduled to meet. He was the star of the show. The rest was just details. Finally, the summons arrived. An email, exquisitely formal and respectful, from the executive assistant to the CEO. "Dear Mr. Ashton," it began, "the leadership team has been exceptionally impressed with your candidacy. We would be honored to invite you for a final interview to be held in person with our Chief Executive Officer at our corporate headquarters." Mark read the email aloud, his voice booming with a triumphant vindication he had not felt in years. He was back. They embraced, Clara weeping with relief, Mark beaming with pride. Their nightmare was over. Their future was secure. He had an appointment to meet his savior, the anonymous CEO, who had the wisdom to recognize his genius. He had no idea he had an appointment with his past. The bait had been swallowed, the hook was set deep, and the line was now being reeled in, slowly and inexorably. The headquarters of Aura Analytics was a monument of glass and steel, a gleaming shard of architecture that pierced the city skyline. As Mark Ashton stepped out of the taxi, he straightened his $1,000 suit, a feeling of triumphant vindication washing over him. The doorman nodded at him with deference. The lobby was a vast, silent atrium of Italian marble and brushed steel, a cathedral built to the god of capital. "This," he thought, his chest swelling with pride, "is where I belong." This was not a job interview, it was a coronation. His journey to the top floor was a silent, swift ascent in a glass elevator, the city unfolding beneath him like a map of his soon-to-be reclaimed kingdom. The executive assistant, a poised and polished woman, greeted him with a respectful smile and led him down a quiet, art-lined hallway to a pair of imposing oak doors. "Miss Thorne will see you now," she said, her voice a soft murmur. The office was breathtaking. It was a corner suite with 2 entire walls of floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a 180-degree panorama of the world. The space was vast, minimalist, and exuded a sense of absolute power. A woman stood with her back to him, her hands clasped behind her back, looking out at the view. She was tall and slender, dressed in an impeccably tailored dark gray suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, elegant style. Mark cleared his throat, a confident smile already forming on his lips. The woman turned slowly. For a fraction of a second, Mark felt a strange, inexplicable flicker of something deep in his memory, a ghost of a familiarity that vanished as quickly as it came. But the woman before him was a stranger. She was beautiful, yes, but in a way that was cold and formidable, her features sharp and intelligent, her eyes holding a calm, unreadable depth. This was not a woman you charmed, this was a woman you obeyed. "Mr. Ashton," she said, her voice smooth and perfectly modulated. "Thank you for coming. I'm Miss Thorne." The name meant nothing to him. He strode forward, extending his hand, his smile wide and practiced. "The pleasure is all mine, Miss Thorne. It's an honor." Her handshake was firm, cool, and brief. She gestured to one of the 2 chairs positioned before her massive, empty desk. "Please." The charade began. For the first 20 minutes, Amelia let him perform. She was the perfect picture of a discerning, interested executive. She maintained eye contact, nodded in all the right places, and asked broad, open-ended questions. "Tell me about your vision for this role. Walk me through what you consider your greatest professional achievement." Mark, believing he had the full measure of the room, launched into his well-rehearsed mythology. He was the visionary, the rainmaker, the brilliant strategist. He spoke of his time at Sterling Corp as if he had personally steered the company through a golden age. He described the demise of his own firm as a noble battle against unforeseen market forces, a valuable, if humbling, learning experience in a volatile economic climate. He was smooth, condescending, and utterly captivating in his own self-delusion. He felt he was winning her over, that she was, like everyone else, being dazzled by his brilliance. He saw her quiet attentiveness, not as the patience of a predator, but as the rapt admiration of a future colleague. When he had finally finished his grand monologue, a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. The air grew stiller, colder. Amelia's polite, professional mask remained in place, but her questions, which had been softballs, now became surgical scalpels. "Your time at Sterling was indeed impressive," she began, her tone unchanged. "You mention increasing your division's profitability by 30%. I'm fascinated by the granular details of such a success. Could you walk me through the specific cost-saving initiatives and market penetration strategies you personally designed and implemented to achieve that figure?" Mark blinked. He began to stammer, speaking in vague generalities about synergy and leveraging assets. The achievement had been his director's, a victory he had happily taken credit for in subsequent job interviews for years. Under the calm, unwavering gaze of this woman, his story suddenly felt flimsy, transparent. She moved on before he could fully recover. "The Ashton Advisory Group," she said, her gaze dropping to his resume on her desk. "A bold venture. To strike out on one's own requires immense courage. Tell me from your perspective as its founder, what was the fundamental structural flaw in the business model that prevented it from securing its second round of funding?" She had phrased it as a test of his analytical mind, but it was a direct invitation for him to lie about his own incompetence. He mumbled about risk-averse investors and a tight credit market, the excuses sounding weak and pathetic even to his own ears. The room was no longer a stage for his triumph. It was a courtroom, and he was on the stand. Her questions became more personal, yet were always cloaked in the language of corporate evaluation. "Our culture here is built on a foundation of absolute integrity and loyalty," she said, her eyes boring into his. "Could you describe a time in your career when your personal loyalty was tested and how you navigated that ethical challenge?" A fine sheen of sweat began to form on Mark's brow. This was not a job interview, it was a cross-examination. Her knowledge of his career was unnervingly deep, her questions too precise, too pointed. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted. He had walked in as the prize, the conquering hero. Now, he felt like an insect pinned to a board. The confident smile was gone, replaced by a tight, nervous rictus. His practiced answers evaporated, leaving only defensiveness. He felt stripped bare, exposed by a woman who was a total stranger, yet who looked at him as if she knew every single one of his sins. The interview was over. He knew it. He just didn't know why. He sat in a state of confused, mounting dread as she leaned forward slightly, the polite mask finally dropping away, replaced by an expression of cold, crystalline focus. She picked up a simple, inexpensive pen from the corner of her otherwise empty desk, turning it over and over in her long, steady fingers. "Your professional history is one story, Mr. Ashton," she said, her voice dropping to a lower, quieter register that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "But I find that a company, like a man, is only as strong as its foundation." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "So let's go back. Let's talk about the very beginning. Let's talk about the sacrifices that were made to get you started." Mark stared at her, his mind struggling to process the question. Sacrifices? He was the one who had sacrificed, struggling through business school, enduring the pressure. He opened his mouth to formulate a self-pitying answer, but her calm, unwavering gaze stopped him. There was something ancient in her eyes, a knowledge that went far beyond his resume. I don't understand what you mean," he stammered, the first crack appearing in his polished armor. Amelia didn't respond immediately. She rose from her chair with a fluid, unhurried grace and walked towards the vast window, her silhouette framed against the sprawling city. "An education like yours is not a small thing," she said, her voice a soft, reflective murmur that seemed to fill the cavernous room. "It costs more than just money. It costs time. It costs sleep. It costs the youth and energy of the people who believe in you." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "It costs thousands of hours spent on tired feet, on unforgiving linoleum floors. The smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. The weight of heavy plates. The forced, empty smiles for strangers." She was painting a picture, and with each stroke, a cold, sickening dread began to crawl up Mark's spine. A memory, deep and long buried, was being exhumed against his will. The woman at the window was a stranger, but her words were echoes from a life he had purposefully forgotten. He started to shake his head, a gesture of denial. This was impossible, a trick, but she wasn't finished. "You build a whole life on a foundation like that," she continued, her voice still quiet, yet carrying an immense weight. "You build it with glass and steel, you climb as high as you can, but you can never truly escape it. No matter how high you are, you can never forget the person whose dreams you ground into dust to build your first step." She turned from the window to face him, and for the first time, the professional mask was gone. Her eyes were not the eyes of Miss Thorne, the CEO. They were the eyes of a ghost, and they were filled with a cold, clear light of judgment. "Let's be realistic, Mark," she said, and her voice shifted, perfectly mimicking the confident, condescending tone he had used with Clara on a rainy night 15 years ago. "Some people, they'll never be more than a waitress." The world stopped. The air in his lungs turned to ice. It wasn't her face that he finally recognized. It was his own sin, his own long-forgotten cruelty, played back to him with perfect, chilling accuracy. The name, a strangled, horrified whisper, escaped his lips. "Amelia." He said it not as a question, but as a curse. He sprang to his feet, babbling, denying. "No, it can't be. You left." Amelia watched his panic with the serene disinterest of a goddess watching a mortal squirm. "I did," she said calmly. She touched a smooth, unmarked panel on her desk. "But you see, I kept a souvenir of the occasion." From speakers so perfectly integrated into the room that they seemed to be the voice of the office itself, a sound emerged. It was the sound of rain, and a man's voice, his own voice, dripping with arrogance and intimacy. It was the phone call. Crystal clear, digitally remastered, his entire betrayal played back in high fidelity. He heard his own laughter. He heard his plans to discard her. He heard himself deliver the line that had just condemned him, and then the final, soul-shattering sound, Clara's soft, triumphant giggle. He collapsed back into his chair as if his bones had dissolved, his face ashen, the sound of his own treachery echoing in the monument to his failure. While the recording still played softly in the background, a soundtrack to his damnation, Amelia walked back to her desk. "The recording is a matter of the heart," she said, her voice now crisp and all business. "Let's conclude with your professional evaluation." She picked up a sheet of paper, Blackwood Holdings, Orion Capital Ventures, the Sterling Group. Do these names sound familiar, Mark? They should. You've been railing against them for the past year. You thought you were the victim of predatory, faceless corporations. She looked at him, her expression devoid of any emotion but a profound finality. "They aren't faceless. They have my face. Every dollar of debt you have, every loan, every late notice, it all leads back to me. Your bad luck wasn't the market, Mark. It was me. I owned your company. I owned your home. I owned you." Mark could only stare, his mouth agape, a silent scream trapped in his throat. "And this job," she said, with a gesture that encompassed the magnificent room, the breathtaking view, the promise of salvation, this role of Chief Strategy Officer, it never existed. There is no job. There is only this room, a stage I built, for the sole purpose of having this conversation. As if on cue, the grand oak doors to the office swung open. Amelia's assistant stood there, her expression professionally blank. And beside her, beaming, dressed in a celebratory outfit, was Clara. "Mark, darling," she trilled, stepping into the room. "I couldn't wait outside another second. How did it?" Her voice died in her throat, her joyous smile froze, then shattered. She saw her husband, a broken, ashen ruin in a chair, and then she saw the woman standing behind the desk. Time and power had changed her, but there was no mistaking the ghost from their past. "Amelia," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth, her face a mask of pure horror. "You see," Amelia said, addressing them both now, her two betrayers united at last in their ruin. "You made a critical business error, both of you. You underestimated your assets. You saw a simple, dutiful waitress who was useful for a time. You never imagined she might have a mind of her own, a will of her own." She pressed a button on her desk. "You destroyed that girl. You took her love and her sacrifice and you burned it for fuel. But you should know, fire doesn't just destroy, it also forges." Two large, impassive men in dark suits entered the room, moving to stand behind Mark and Clara. "Your house is in foreclosure," Amelia stated flatly. "Your accounts will be frozen by the end of the day. You have nothing. That was the price of my education. Now the debt is paid." Mark and Clara just stared, speechless, their world collapsing around them in the terrible, silent office. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashton are leaving now," Amelia said to the security guards, her voice cold and dismissive. She had already turned her back on them, looking out at her city. She did not grant them the dignity of watching their final humiliation as they were escorted out, their pathetic, choked sobs, the only sound breaking the silence. The doors closed, and Amelia Thorne was alone again, the quiet hum of her empire, the only sound that mattered. The reckoning was complete. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the office in a profound and sudden silence. The echoes of the confrontation, Clara's choked sobs, Mark's pathetic, sputtering denials vanished as if they had never been. Amelia remained standing by the window, her back to the room, long after they were gone. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant, bleeding strokes of orange and violet. For 15 years, she had carried the memory of that rainy night like a shard of glass in her heart. Every success, every step up the ladder, every victory had been measured against that single, defining moment of absolute betrayal. Now, the shard had been removed. There was no elation, no savage thrill of victory. Instead, there was only a vast, quiet, and unfamiliar sense of peace. It was the calm that follows a storm that has lasted for half a lifetime. It was the silence of a long and complex program that has finally executed its final line of code. It was the feeling of a debt paid in full. Her gaze drifted across the immaculate, minimalist space and settled on the single personal object she allowed on her desk. A simple, elegant silver picture frame. It was not a picture of a new husband or a child, not a monument to a new life built to spite the old one. It was a photograph of a much younger Amelia, her face still bearing the faint shadows of her past hardships, but with a genuine, hopeful smile in her eyes. Standing next to her, his hand resting proudly on her shoulder, was David Chen, her first mentor, the CEO who had seen the brilliant mind hiding behind the quiet, guarded exterior of an intern named Amy. He had been the first person to offer her a hand not out of pity, but out of respect. He had taught her, guided her, and had been the first to invest in her vision for Nexus Innovations. To any outsider, it was a touching tribute to a valued mentor. But like everything in Amelia's world, its true meaning was layered, deep, and known only to her. For this was never just a story about a broken heart. It was the story of a much older debt. Years ago, when David had decided to become her patron, he had shared his own story. He spoke of his father, an honest man who had run a small, successful furniture business, Chen Woodworks. And he spoke of a young, ruthless consultant from a prestigious firm, a man with a dazzling smile and a vocabulary of poisonously optimistic buzzwords. This consultant had convinced David's father to take on a mountain of unsustainable debt to fund a reckless expansion, earning himself a massive commission in the process. The business, unable to service the loans, had collapsed. The Chen family lost everything: their company, their home, their life savings. David's father died a few years later, a man broken by shame and financial ruin. The name of that charming, ambitious young consultant, who had built his own career on the ashes of an honest family, was Mark Ashton. The money Mark had earned from the destruction of Chen Woodworks was the seed capital for the lavish life he began with Clara. The betrayal of Amelia was not his first act of parasitic destruction. It was simply the next logical step in his business model. When David had told Amelia his story, it was as a cautionary tale. But Amelia, with her mind that saw systems and patterns in everything, saw something else. She saw a debt that had never been paid. She realized that her own personal tragedy was merely a single data point in a much larger, more predatory algorithm of a man who consumed others for his own advancement. In that moment, her vague, long-term desire for success transformed into a cold, precise, and far grander plan. Her revenge would not just be for the waitress he had discarded. It would be for the honest man he had ruined. It would be justice for the mentor who had saved her. And so, as Amelia stood in the twilight, the silence of her office was not empty. It was full. It was full of the ghosts of all of Mark's sins, finally brought to account. The justice she had delivered was not just for herself, but for all the unseen, unacknowledged victims of his casual cruelty. She picked up the frame, a soft, genuine smile finally touching her lips. Her work was done. The scales were balanced. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much, for in that silence, they are not breaking, they are not grieving, they are not surrendering. In that silence, they are observing, learning, and calculating. In that silence, they are forging their pain into a weapon, sharpening their will on the stone of their own suffering. In that silence, they are planning, rebuilding, and preparing to reclaim not just what was taken from them, but the fundamental justice they are owed. Thank you for listening. Join us next time for another story from the shadows of family secrets.